I am Chandrasekhar Dubey, a professor in the Department of English, Syed Bhagat Singh Evening College, University of Delhi. Today, I will be discussing development of the Canadian novel and its early phase. The journey of the Canadian novel begins in the pre-Confederation period and it culminates on the advent of the World War I. This was a journey which covered almost 150 years in different phases. But the growth of the Canadian novel has been through different phases determined by historical, social, political and religious forces of Canada. It is worth mentioning here, what do I mean by Confederation? Confederation refers to the unification of Canada with the American-dominated colonies of North Scotia and Brunswick with the provinces of the Canada. The implication of this unification was very high for the Canadian people in terms of historical, social, spiritual as well as moral growth of the people. All these developments entered into the body of literature and Canadian novel was not untouched by these developments. Today we are going to discuss the Canadian novel in different phases. I will be telling you about the first initial phase in pre-Confederation period, Confederation period, post-Confederation period, and then its movement from formative phase to the matured phase in the early 20th century. So let us begin our journey of the growth of Canadian novel over the years, and we will be discussing here different characteristics of the novels, the writers who were engaged with different subjects, and the gradual growth of Canadian fiction, which was towards the end of the 19th century at par with the international novel writers in English. So let's have a glance at it. The first phase of the Canadian novel. The first phase in Canadian novel writing marks a period between earliest fiction writing in Canada and World War I. During this period, novel acquired a true Canadian voice. In the pre-Confederation period, novels were written and published by these novels not only of much literary significance, the subject matters or point of view of such novels were hardly distinctively Canadian in theme. Most of these novels were derivative in nature. A Canadian novel in this phase was going through a phase of transition. This was a phase of transition when society, culture and polity of the country were taking shape. The novelists were looking for such grounds which may reflect the Canadian voice in thematic representation. There is colonial uncertainty reflected in the derivativeness and the quality of the novel. Some of these novels were striking grounds for Canadian social, cultural values by preparing the soils for establishing the tradition of Canadian novel writing. First Canadian novel, Francis Brooks' History of Emile Montague, 1769, has been described as first Canadian novel. Brooke lived for a short period in Quebec, and her novel shows the influence of Victorian novels in England. The novel is a sentimental romance in epistolary form with Canadian landscapes as settings. Here, Brooke also gives a good picture of spring in the city of Quebec. It also gives details of lives, manners, and culture of Canadian people, setting a stage for future Canadian novelists. Now let us come to the narrative patterns in the early Canadian phase. Several narrative patterns emerged in the early Canadian fiction as evident in the novels of this phase. Gradual withdrawal of the community against wilderness, migration, settlement, and alienation. A person's attempt to get liberated from burden of past, suppression, and colonial conflicts. A child's growth against the burdens of legacies, celebration of space and wilderness. In this phase, there is a remarkable development on the theme of alienation of the people who came to Canada as settlers, and they had many practical problems there. Many of the novelists of this period give depiction of the struggles of their life and also the problems they faced in day-to-day life in the Canadian cities. So these novels became remarkable for many writers in the coming time, not only as a model but also as a pattern of narratives that could weave the history of Canada in simple words and in native settings. The struggle of a woman following her creative pursuits and her conflicts form a recurring motive in novel in this phase. As I told you earlier, narratives of settlers and explorers were predominant themes in this period. Pains of environmental loss and destruction and anxiety of future, relationship between man and nature in Canadian ecosystem was also one of the significant themes during this phase. Earlier forms and publications. While examining the novels in the earlier phase in Canada, let us look into earlier forms and publications of these works. The earlier forms were adventure stories, epistolary, sentimental romance, autobiographical and historical novels. Most of these novels were published in literary, journal and newspapers. These were also serialized. It was very close to the 19th century novels in England when Dickens and other popular writers' novels were being serialized in journals and sketch magazines. Some of the works of Susanna Moodie and Thomas McCulloch appeared in such journals. They remained under the influence of British novelists. McCulloch's The Letters of Mephibosheth Stepsor was published in Acadian Recorder 1821-23. The first Canadian fiction writer, Halliburton, was to achieve international reputation was influenced by McCulloch's works. His novel Clockmaker, or The Sayings and Doings of Samuel Slick of Slick Valley 1836 became very popular. Halliburton was no doubt a major literary figure in pre-Confederation phase. His novel The Old Judge 1849 was immensely popular, and he remained a significant novelist in Canadian literary tradition. The other novelists of the period, namely Rosanna Prohon, John Richardson used powerful imagination by using melodramatic and historical settings to their novels. Rosanna's The Manor House of the Villeret, 1859 to 60, and Antoinette the Meyer Court, 1864, and Richardson's The Canadian Brothers, 1840, inspired the future novelists and readers. In these novels, we also find the colonial relationship of Canada with the other countries. Richardson shows remarkable influence of Walter Scott in treatment of historical theme. He attempts to define the historical Canadian character with imagination and melodrama. Now let us come to post-Confederation novel. This phase marked the growth of Canadian novel in a matured form. The Confederation period is characterized by nationalistic and optimistic spirit as reflected in Canadian novels. Maya Agnes Fleming, Basil King, Margaret Marshall Saunders were not only popular but best-selling authors. Margaret Marshall's The Beautiful Joe, which was published in 1894, it was a sentimental story of a dog, and it has been reported to have been sold millions copies in 14 languages. These novelists were writing for home as well as abroad audiences. Their success was great motivating force for Canadian novel. One of the remarkable characteristics of Canadian novel in post-Confederation period was representation of the regions of Canada. Anne of Green Gables, 1908, was set in Prince Edward Island. Duncan Polite, 1905, was set in Scottish communities in West Ontario. The opening up of Canada's western north was also a recurrent subject of many novels in this phase. Here, the Canadian setting was important because prior to this phase, most of the novelists who were either Canadian or outsider, they were using the foreign settings for Canadian life, which was not true representation of the life and spirit of the Canada, and therefore this period is remarkable for use of narrative technique, locales, and physical settings of landscapes of Canada. And most of these novels try to carve their characters in these settings, giving a tone and texture of things Canadian. One of the characteristics of the novels during this period was didacticism and moralizing. Therefore, didacticism and moralizing were predominant themes of many novels during this period. However, such novels failed to get artistic success. Major novels overcame the problems of moralizing without preaching readers any longer. They seemed to work. The novels written during the Confederation period addressed social, regional, historical, national, and intellectual concerns. This phase also marked the growth of themes of education, religion, polity, French and English relations in a small town of Quebec. The Cure of St. Philip, which was published in 1899 by Francis William Gray, is comic and crafty analysis of education, religion, and politics. During this phase, many novels were written which were satirical on the education system which was prevalent in Canada, and these novelists probably appealed to the masses for reforms in education. A similar voice which resonates in England while Dickens was writing for reform in education. Robert Barr's The Measure of the Rule, 1907, is a satirical criticism of a teacher training and theorizing education. This was a very successful novel. Development of early Canadian novel, and during this phase, we can say the last decades of the 19th century, saw the growth of Canadian novel in terms of variety of themes, forms, preparing a fertile ground for novel to usher in its matured phase of early 20th century. Canada underwent social, religious, political changes which touched every fiber of life. The imitative voice was gradually replaced by the distinct Canadian voice. The 20th century from formative to matured phase of novel writing. The beginning of the 20th century saw the development of Canadian novel from formative phase to a matured phase, as evident in works of major writers of this period. Mention may be made here of Sarah, Janet, Duncan, and Stephen Leacock. Duncan is known for her novels Cousin Cinderella, 1908, The Imperialist, 1904, Set in Authority, 1906. Duncan's treatment of Canadian consciousness, coupled with his wit and his skill, make his work closer to the heart of Canadian people. Let me tell you here that these novelists helped to create a collective consciousness of the people in Canadian novel, where they could resonate the voice of Canada, the settings of Canada, and also the concerns for many issues for the people of Canada. Leacock's novels are characterized by parodying, depiction of surrealistic violence, various forms, styles, and subversion of conventional fiction. Leacock's major novels are Sunshine Sketches of a Little Town, 1912, Arcadian Adventures with Ideal Rich, 1914. These works are known for his humorous depiction of frailties and foibles of the community, satirical portrayal of characters. Themes like materialism, urbanization, and politics have been treated with depthness and humor. These novels present various themes relevant to their social, historical, and political backgrounds, which not only appealed to the modern readers but created a substantial ground for Canadian novel with temperament, technique, and craft rooted in Canada, which may be seen as a Canadian in esprit and craft. These novels present themes of freedom and survival and relate them to social as well as external realities of the world. Dark themes, dismal tone, satirical jibes of the novelist, as evident in some works towards the end of this phase, could hardly envisage the grievous loss that Canada had to suffer in the First World War. Now, let us sum up what we have learned today in this video lecture that would come to you in the form of the conclusive remark of this lecture. The journey of Canadian novel in its early phase begins with pre-Confederation phase and continues till the First World War. It covers almost more than 150 years. Confederation phase in Canadian history marked consolidation, stability, strength for Canada and its people. The changes that occurred influenced the social, economic, political and literary life of the people. This also serves as milestone in the journey from nascent formative phase of novel writing in Canada to imitative phase, a phase that exerted a strong influence of English and American writers on the native writers. In Confederation period and post-Confederation period, Canadian novel acquired a distinct Canadian voice. In post-Confederation period, novel in Canada got diversified in depiction of themes, portrayal of characters, narration and forms. Novelists could represent wider themes through myriad forms in Canadian setting and milieu, which appeal to wider range of readers at home and the world. The narrative patterns of earlier phase, as told earlier in this lecture, were those of immigration, alienation,